every country we went to, I really tried to like seek out the local culture to just try to like explain life to me. And then, it may sound a little bit like eat, pray, love, but that's kind of what I was doing.
Welcome to the Dad Bod, a podcast that tells a story of what it means to be a dad today, one dad at a time. My name is Sean, and I'm a dad living in New York City with my wife and our two young native New Yorkers. The formula for the Dad Bod is simple. Each episode, we're going to interview one dad to get his story of being a dad. Over time, all of these stories will start to create the bigger story of what it means to be a dad today. Thank you very much to everyone for tuning in. If you like what we're doing with the Dad Bod, share it with your friends and family, because these meaningful conversations about fatherhood are a great way to a meaningful conversation of your own with someone that you care about. So the voice you heard at the beginning of the show belongs to my new friend and fellow dad, Doug. Huge thanks to Andrew, Dim Sum Dad, for introducing us. Doug is actually the second dad that Andrew has introduced me to, so after you've listened to this episode, go listen to TJ, 7 Habits of Dad, to hear the first. I was eager to learn more about Doug's unique lifestyle. A few years ago, Doug moved with his family from New York City to Taiwan to live a life that gives them the freedom to travel frequently, enjoy outdoorsy activities, and raise their kids as native Chinese speakers in an immersive Taiwanese cultural environment, all while still operating the US-based e-commerce business that Doug started once upon a time as a side hustle to his data analytics career in NYC. As you're about to hear, Doug and I had a great conversation about his life in Taiwan, but more importantly, we talk about the years-long journey to find the answer to a universal burning question that led him there. All right, enough talking now. I am really pleased to be sharing this with you. Doug, Pursuit of Happiness Dad. I'll let you introduce yourself. So introduce yourself. Tell me your name, whether you're married, how old your kids are, their genders, where you live, what you do for a living, as well as any other hats that you wear or commitments that you keep that are worth mentioning.
Sure. So my name is Doug. I'm 40 and I'm married with 2 daughters. Their ages 7 and 9. For work, I started off working at some of the financial firms in New York. I did that for a little bit, and then I bounced around to some startups. And then about 9 years ago, I started my own online e-commerce business. We sell mostly on Amazon, and our logistics are all in the US. I'm able to work remotely. So we've been kind of doing that for the past 9 years. And because of that flexibility, we've been able to travel, we've been able to live abroad. So prior to COVID, we were traveling full time. And because of COVID, we had sort of to make a decision where we wanted to be based. And we decided that we wanted to be in Taiwan. We wanted to give our kids an opportunity to learn Chinese and just be exposed to another culture. So we've been here for the past 4.5, almost 5 years.
Awesome. Okay. So normally I start with tell me where you grew up and all that, but this is just too interesting, your life, where it is right now. So tell me more about that 4.5 years in Taiwan. And then also before that, you had, some full-time traveling, I guess, and also starting the e-commerce business. So kind of take me back, sort of tell me about the past 9 years in particular.
Sure. I think in terms of work, I've never sort of found career satisfaction in work. So for me, it was always, I was always looking for something outside of work to sort of find fulfillment. Once we had kids, I mean, I knew I wanted to spend more time with them. And my wife and I always loved traveling. So we would try to travel, but based on the typical American vacation schedule, you kind of only get 2-3 weeks a year. And one of the things that we noticed was that when we would travel, we often ran into like older folks that were retired and basically have both time and money to travel. The more I thought about it, the more I wanted to prioritize those things earlier in my life because I didn't know what I would be doing when I was older and whether I would have the means to travel then, and also the health, right? So, and then another concept that was really important to us is spending time with our kids. I really believe that between the ages of basically 0 to 12, that's sort of their golden years. And we wanted to spend as much time as we could in those ages because once they become teenagers, they become less and less reliant on you and they want to do their own things. They want to be with their own friends. They have their own agendas. And basically, their time spent with you will diminish. And also, your own influence on them will also diminish. And basically, after 18, you've already like experienced 90% of your interaction with your kids. So, based on that, we really wanted to focus on the first 12 years. So for me, I mean, the e-commerce business was more something that I did on the side while I was also working a corporate job. Luckily, like I kind of rode the wave of sort of e-commerce before it got to where it is now. So I kind of got in early and it kind of just was a wave that I kind of rode until now. And the whole like remote working thing, I kind of got in that a little bit early as well. So I would say, I just got a little bit lucky. And because of those two things, we were able to kind of live the life on our own terms. So for basically 2 years, we traveled around the world and our concept was like slow travel, which was trying to spend about a month in each country that we went to. And what we would do is we would enroll our kids in local preschools. It may not be in English. So they've been in school all over the world in different languages. And that was also important for us just to instill like flexibility in them. We would be able to basically go to any school, we would be able to drop them off and they wouldn't cry. So while our kids were in preschool, we would work and also have time to sort of explore the local neighborhood. And generally we would try to quote unquote live in a more local neighborhood away from sort of the tourist destinations. So basically we did that for 2 years and then COVID came and then we had to make a decision where we wanted to be based. At that time, a lot of people had told us to go back to the US. This is before like borders closed or anything. So you kind of had to make a decision with limited information. Luckily, I thought we made a good decision. We came to Taiwan. Taiwan was about as normal as you could get during COVID. And the reason we wanted to come to Taiwan, there was multiple reasons. We wanted to live here at some point anyways. So we actually had, before COVID, sort of set up a life here in terms of getting my kids the residency that they needed, finding a school that would be appropriate for us, finding like a neighborhood that we might want to live in. So actually when COVID happened and we flew here, we were able to plug in pretty easily because we had that infrastructure sort of already in place. And I kind of mentioned it before. I mean, we wanted our kids to learn Chinese. We wanted them to be exposed to other cultures. So we've been here. It was supposed to be sort of a shorter term experiment. Our initial idea was to do that, get them that exposure. And we also wanted to use Taiwan as a base to travel Asia. So we did that for, a year, and then we decided to roll it on another year. And then after that, we decided to roll it on another year. And I mean, at that point also, like COVID didn't go away that fast, right? It kind of had a lingering effect and life was pretty good. And so we decided to keep going. And at that time, one of our focus was to have our kids learn Chinese. So we had them in a fully Chinese environment. We didn't have them in any English environment because we thought maybe if we're here for short term, we wanted them to get the most possible. And basically at some point they became like native Chinese speakers. It came to a point where their native tongue was Chinese and that the kids would communicate to each other in Chinese and they would communicate to us in English. So it got to a point where we felt like if we had moved, it would be kind of taking them away from that opportunity. And we just wanted to continue to build that base for them of Chinese. Aside from that, we just really enjoy the life that we live here. Just to talk about that a little bit more, I mean, one thing that's big for us is just being an outdoorsy family. So here, it's a very outdoorsy sort of place. There's great hiking, there's great biking, there's a great running community. There's people doing like river tracing, there's people snorkeling, going to the beach. It's just, it's basically a tropical island. So it's quite warm most of the year and you can be out. So the kids really enjoy that. We really enjoy that. And we've met a number of people that sort of kind of live a very similar life to us, which I actually feel like would have been harder to replicate. Definitely would have been harder to replicate in the US, but possibly abroad as well. That I'm not as sure about, but we definitely have a community of people here who have sort of like an international background and people kind of who run their own business or are entrepreneurial or sort of living a alternative lifestyle. And I think like one thing that we had sort of discussed and one thing that I kind of find important to me is that right now I'm kind of living the life that I want on my own terms. And that may be non-traditional or it doesn't kind of look like what the typical family may be living. We are not very excited about the idea of just like being in the suburbs and living a pretty standard, American dream type of life. I think from our perspective, there's just so much more out there that we want to explore and want to see, we want to expose our kids to. We feel like right now, Taiwan is the best place for us. I think in terms of a little bit of a longer term plan, we definitely want to stay for at least another 2, 3 years just to get our kids' Chinese up to a certain level. And then from there, we're open to another destination. My personal belief is that to understand people, language is really important. To understand cultures, language is really important. History is really important. And I would love to have the opportunity to have them live in another country that's not English speaking. So that's something that we're exploring, but it's a couple years away. So we haven't made a final decision on that yet.
So for you, I guess there's so much I imagine like anybody listening to this would want to kind of learn from your kind of what you're doing with your life, this alternative lifestyle, and yet at the same time, it's intimidating. Like a lot of the things that you've been able to do, such as put your kids in a truly immersive environment where they're going to be able to learn Chinese, that's obviously requires an uprooting of your life. How do you, just help me, how do I wrap my head around that?
Yeah, I would say one is like we've gotten really lucky in that we've mostly haven't had any issues. So I think in that way, I've kind of said a couple of times that like I think we've gotten really lucky that our kids are I think naturally they're quite flexible and naturally they are able to have that sort of personality. And two, they have each other, and even if everything goes wrong, like they will always have each other and they will always be able to support each other. They'll always be at least in that environment together. And actually, when my older one started elementary school, we were actually a little bit nervous. That was the first time they had been apart because she would start elementary school while my younger one was still in preschool. I mean, everything turned out fine, but it was kind of like we knew that they've always been together and this was sort of the first time they would be apart.
Right. Even though you guys are moving around a lot, they always had that anchor. They always had each other as an anchor. Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
I see.
And the other thing that's super important, and I'm sure other people have talked about, is that having a partner that's supportive and also sort of on board and on the same page. I think that's the most important thing because we had sort of talked about what our values were, what's important to us, and what we were willing to fight for. And then if there was hardships, what we were willing to push through. So, I mean, of course, there were hardships. Of course, there were instances where, things were not as easy as we had hoped. But thankfully, my wife also believed in a lot of the same things. She was a great support system for my kids. And, anytime we ran into any problems, we would sort of attack it together. I think that made at least, our problem solving a lot easier because sometimes we're not exactly on the same page. The first reaction might be to just blame each other, right? Because, I wanted to do this or you didn't want to do that. And I think luckily we didn't fall into that because we both sort of believed in the same mission of what we were trying to accomplish. And I think part of it is also just like trial and error. I think the hardest thing was definitely moving to Taiwan because it wasn't temporary. The thing about a temporary move is that if it doesn't work out, you're going somewhere in the next couple of weeks, right? And there were definitely places where we went, we were like, okay, I'm kind of done with this place. I'm ready for the next place. And which is fine. But like for Taiwan, it was kind of like, well, you had to find an apartment and it was like semi-permanent and you had to find a school and the school was not going to be like a 2-week school. It was going to be like a 4-year commitment. And I think what was interesting for me was just an appreciation of all the immigrants because the US is full of immigrant stories. It's just truly amazing, just the amount of work and the difficulty that it takes to immigrate to a new country. And, nowadays we're so blessed with the internet and Google Translate and all the resources that we have, and that it's so easy to connect to people who are like you. I think I definitely have a newfound appreciation for immigrant story, especially people that did that in previous generations and people that did it in previous generations. That was, it was even harder. They didn't have the support system. It wasn't common. It's a huge hurdle. And I mean, you're kind of asking, like, how would I advise people to do it? Or, it's pretty challenging. And I would definitely say it's incredibly challenging. And we face definitely a lot of frustration in terms of just like not understanding culture, like how things are done. But as I look back on it, I mean, it's definitely, one of the best decisions that we've made. And you kind of hear all these immigrant stories in the US. And I think for most of those, stories that you hear, like people do not regret doing this big change only because like, the opportunity on the other side is so great. And if it's something that you really believe in, of course, you're going to face hardships at times, but the reward is usually worth it.
One thing that I want to go a little deeper on that you talked about is the strong partnership with your wife. And that doesn't just happen overnight. Like, the first checkbox is have a strong partnership. Okay, got it. It's not like packing a bag, make sure you've got the clothes and the toothbrush. The strong partnership, something that's, built up over time. So, can you tell me a little bit about your experience building a strong partnership with your wife?
I think similar to what I was saying about kids, I find that in general, I've been quite lucky in life. And there's a lot of things I didn't know about my wife that I know a lot better now. And that was also very lucky because some of the things that I didn't know about turned out to be quite handy. And some of the ways that we were actually compatible, I didn't know about, and just kind of happened to be that we're compatible for living in another country or compatible for living abroad or planning logistics and things like that. So in that way, I would first acknowledge that, I've just gotten incredibly lucky with some of the things. And two, I think we just spent a lot of time while we lived in New York trying to figure out the life that we wanted. I wasn't always happy with, my time in New York in terms of my career or like if that was a place I wanted to live. So I spent a lot of time in my late 20s and early 30s just like thinking about it and thinking about the life I actually wanted to live. And because of that, we had a lot of conversations and a lot of really hard conversations because my wife is a native New Yorker. So New York is her home. New York is where all her friends are. And I don't think she ever imagined leaving New York. So there was definitely a lot of tough conversations that we had in terms of like, okay, I don't think I see my future in New York. What would that look like if we were to live somewhere else? And we just had to sort of like play out different scenarios. And I think having these like really important conversations before you execute on anything is really important because then you kind of like know that, okay, if it doesn't go exactly to your scenario, how would you react? And, and also it's like, okay, this is the decision that we're making together, right? So it's like, if it may not go right or, it's not anybody's fault. It's just like we planned the different scenarios and we kind of talked it out. We're very thorough about that. It definitely helped. And then I think one more thing in terms of compatibility, we also got a little bit lucky here just because I am more high level. So I look at a lot of more like macro planning. So I think a lot about these big, questions about my life, like what I want to be doing, like where I want to be, like, how I want to raise my kids at a more macro level. Whereas my wife is a lot more micro. She's very good at detail. She's very detail oriented. She's very good at executing. I sort of handle one side of the planning. She does another side of the planning. And actually we work together in our business and it often works the same way. Like I think it's a little bit rare to have a husband and wife business in that way. You spend a lot of time with each other and we probably spend extra time with each other because we also travel together. But I think what's helped us is that like we kind of have our own part that we focus on and that's sort of our specialty. And then we rely on the other person to have their specialty. And then we kind of defer to the other partner based on what our own interests are and our own strengths are.
Well, I think one thing I hear in that too is that you guys have different strengths and points of emphasis, but there's also an appreciation for each other that, hey, you bring that thing that I don't have, that piece, that component that I don't have. But I think a lot of times when you have different viewpoints, like one's more macro, one's more micro, they can just grate on each other. Like you don't see things the way I see them. You don't appreciate the details or like, why are you in the weeds when we need to have a plan, a vision? And so I think that's to your guys' credit that there's an appreciation going both ways for that, or at least that's what it sounds like.
I think we definitely have our share of disagreements and hardship, but I think we generally just appreciate that the other person is putting in effort.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of things that I would personally not want to do that my wife really likes doing. And I think there's tons of stuff that she doesn't want to do that I enjoy doing. So there's sort of like a natural split and divide that just works out. And then you kind of just have to appreciate your partner for what they bring to the table, right? And it's sort of like the same thing with all like relationships, right? I mean, like with our kids, like oftentimes they do things very differently than how we would do it. But we often let them just ride it out because we want to see what the results are. We want to see what they learn from it. We want to see, what the outcome is, because I think we're all just also honest with ourselves. It doesn't mean the way that I do it is the best way, the only way, right? There's so many different ways to attack a problem. And I think it's great to be able to see different perspectives. We've been able to get the best results is that like sometimes like what I decide is better and sometimes what my wife decides is better. Doesn't mean that one person is better or worse. It's just that, we work together as a team to work what's better for our family.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your time in New York City, especially what felt like a pivotal time for you, where you were wrestling with a lot of the things about what kind of life you wanted, probably trying to come to grips with, hey, I'm not liking this lifestyle I'm in, this sort of social culture that I'm in. Take me through that. Like, what was your process from like realizing like this isn't where the sort of life I want to be in to actually making some decisions?
I think my personality in general have always been more reflective. I've always been like sort of in my own head a lot. And that's for better, for worse. Sometimes it's not a good thing. I sort of spent most of my years post college in New York. And I think that's a pivotal time for a lot of people trying to figure out what they want out of their lives, right? I mean, you're starting work, you're dating, you're trying to figure out what the next, 40 years of your life might possibly look like. And for me, I felt like I was hitting a lot of walls. I wasn't finding a lot of solutions that I was happy with. And I moved to New York sort of for all the wrong reasons. And then I kind of felt like a fish out of water. So I was kind of like, everybody's like, oh, New York's the coolest place. I got to check it out. And then when I got there, I was like, oh, this is probably not for me. But then it was like my work was there. And it kind of made sense to be there just from a work perspective, but also just from a world perspective. It's like New York is like people are telling me all the time it's the greatest city on earth. Like, why would you ever want to leave? All these, like all these narratives. And I really struggled with that. I was kind of like, am I really going to be like a weirdo and move to the middle of nowhere and just be like a monk or something? Is that what,
But that was on the table. That was on the table at some point when the table was very broad.
Well, I think it's one of those things, when you're unhappy, everything's on the table, right? Because it's like, how am I going to get out of this? And I don't want to be dramatic, but like, I want to say that like a lot of people at that age, that time, we're struggling with a lot of things and we're trying to figure out our life. Like, it's not an easy decision, right? And like the decisions that you make have huge ramifications, right? Like, what career that you decide to take, go back to school, if you decide to move, like who you decide to date and possibly marry, like if you want to have kids, like these have huge ramifications for your life. And in some ways, I just felt like I was on autopilot. I mean, we didn't really talk about my background, but I grew up pretty typical, just following a playbook in terms of like education being important, like going to school, getting a good job. And a good job usually means a high-paying job with security. I think for most people at that point in my life, it was kind of like, okay, like he's on the right path. What I knew was that like deep in my heart, I couldn't make it as, for a lack of a better term, like a cookie cutter Asian. And what I mean by that is basically someone that has a good job on paper, living a life probably to please other people or please their parents or please society. And from a societal point of view, it looks really, really great on paper.
Did you feel like you were doing it to please your parents, or what was sort of what did you feel like you were serving or trying to please?
Yeah. So for me, I don't think I was doing it necessarily to please my parents, but I knew like this was the playbook. So I was just following the playbook and I didn't have any better ideas. It's not like I had some brilliant idea that was distracting me that I could also pursue. So it kind of made sense what I was doing. Everybody encouraged it because we were all in the same boat. I met a lot of people who were doing exactly the same thing. It was like, if we just keep on this path, like in 10 years, like we're going to have a great life. And just throughout the whole thing, I just didn't feel that way,
Yeah.
It was like life is a game and you're constantly leveling up, right? So I was like slowly leveling up. You slowly get promoted. You slowly buy some property. You slowly start like dating people that you might be a potential spouse. You start, maybe you get married and maybe you have kids. And like, these are small little indicators that your life is sort of going according to the playbook. And I think even as I was doing those things, like, for example, I got married, which was great. I had kids, which was great. those are things I've always wanted and are
Yeah.
very happy with. I just knew that something still wasn't right for me.
Mm,
And I think, that's obvious. That was really hard for like my marriage, for example, because I was like I do want it, but there's still something that I was still wrestling with, like I wasn't quite happy with.
yeah.
And I think for me, kind of like going back to the first thing I said about my personality, that was just like my personality. It was just like nagging at me. Like I couldn't just like suppress it and just like, some people are very gritty and they're just able to just like push out any discomfort
Yeah. And grind through
and be
anything
like,
kind of
yeah,
thing.
just
Yeah.
grind it,
Yeah.
and part of that, I think, is personality. Part of it is trained.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they're just really good at it, and I wasn't able to do that. And so I
Yeah.
constantly looked at what was tugging at me, and basically, in the end, I was just like, I got to do something that serves me, and not
Right.
like what like works for supposedly the majority. Basically, like I started tinkering in my own business. Part of it was also traveling too. Like traveling was such an escape for me and my wife. It was sort of like seeing what was out there that was so different than like life in New York.
Right.
And like often now, like people ask me about like these big Asian cities like Tokyo, Seoul, Hong Kong, etc. And I'm like, like they don't do that much for me, just because like the beauty of the world is actually beyond these big cities. It's just like there's so much amazing nature and scenery and people and wildlife. And I mean,
Yeah.
this is kind of like a really silly example, but like I like scuba diving, and you look underneath the surface and you don't think that there's much there, because we don't really think about the ocean ever. But like you start diving and you go like 18 meters, which is what you can do for open water, and you're like, you see a whole different world, right? You're at the
Yeah.
drop off reef, you drop off, but then is like people who do like open water, they keep going, and then it's just like then you realize that like the deepest points of the ocean are like just beyond your imagination. And like the type of marine life, the type of plant life that exists down there is just like something that you can't even fathom, right? So there's just so much out there. And then for me, like as I was slowly exploring different things, I was kind of like more and more drawn to just a different way of life. And then, initially the whole traveling thing was also an experiment. Like everything in my life at that point was an experiment. Like we are going to go and we're going to see what we learn, and then we're going to see how that was going to change our life, basically.
Do you think that's what your wife signed up for when you guys got
Well,
married?
I mean, for me, I mean, I admit that it was sort of a long con, like I always tell her, like I basically conned her. Right? I was like, all right, we'll just do the traveling thing and we'll see what happens, right? You just kind of leave it open-ended. I mean, if you ask her like 10 years ago what her life would be today, she definitely wouldn't have described that. But I think it's sort of a journey that we kind of went through together, because it's sort of our backgrounds are similar, but like very, very different at the same time. And, what our expectations for life was very, very similar. But at the same
Yeah.
time, you marry someone, you're like, oh man, we are so compatible, yet so not compatible at the same time, right? You I think everybody who's married like understands that to some level. That it's just
Yeah.
like you can be so close on certain things, but so far apart. And so it was like one of those things that we were exploring and we were understanding it together.
So yeah, I wanted to kind of ask you a little bit more about that exploration period and just kind of going back to the, sort of moments in marriage, I guess, where you've got the wife, 2 kids, and the job, and you're not happy. Like you're sitting there at the dinner table. As a reflective guy myself, I know for me, when I'm in a rut, I'm just kind of mopey. I'm like, poor energy, like just a negative, just kind of a low key negative energy around me. Is that kind of how you were too in those periods?
Yeah. And I think I was like trying to figure it out. And I think at that time, my wife had a hard time understanding, because I think she's generally quite positive. She's generally very happy with life. And I think for her, her attitude was a little bit typical in New Yorker, which is like, this is the greatest place on earth. Things are
Right.
good. Like life is going
Right.
the way it's supposed to go.
Right.
Like we're like leveling up, right? Aren't we leveling
Yeah.
up? I'm like, yes and no. I mean, we were, but like there was still something nagging at me. So I think like there were times when I was at home and I was just like on my computer doing research and just trying to figure out like what I wanted, and then it definitely caused some tension in our relationship, because she was like, what are you doing? Like, what are you working on that's so important? And I was just telling her it's just like there's something that I'm trying to figure out, and I can't really articulate it because I haven't figured it out yet. But I mean, she knew that I wasn't entirely happy with my situation. She just didn't know like what I was trying to do about it. And
Yeah.
I was trying to explain to her, but it was still so abstract in my head too.
Right.
Uh,
I think in those
so
moments, it's like you don't even know necessarily what the question is, let alone like what the answer is supposed to be. You're just like, I don't know. Something I'm trying to find the answer and the question at the same time. So like now looking back, what was the question you were answering that you
yeah,
were like really trying to find?
well, I think for me, it was just about like what would make me happy. And I know that sounds a little bit cliche or too simple that like, but at this point in my life, I'm just kind of trying to solve for happy. And the truth is like that's different for every person. How people allocate their time, how people allocate their work, how people allocate their money, like happiness can look very different for every person. I think for me, that was what I was trying to figure it out. And
Got
I
it.
think what's important for most people is that like this is sort of a question you don't necessarily find the answer to immediately. And it's something that you should be really wrestling with like your entire life, right? So I think about basically like in my 20s, like that's kind of what I was wrestling with even before I got married. And I think that's really important because like, it's quite dangerous to go into marriage thinking that your spouse is the one that's going to make you happy, right? Like if you're unhappy before you get married, you're probably going to be unhappy when you're married, right? I think. So I think for me it was just like a journey, and like I was doing that for a long time before I met my wife, and I was kind of continuing it after I met my wife as well. So it wasn't like too foreign. Like she knew who I was, she knew my personality, she knew like what I was thinking, she knew. I was pretty upfront with her when we first started dating. I was like, I don't think I'm gonna stay in New York for the long term. At that point when we were dating, actually, I was actively looking for jobs outside of New York. But then I didn't know, because I didn't know it was like, okay, am I unhappy because I live in New York? Am I unhappy because of this job that I have in New York? Is like I was playing with all the different variables. And then going back to the traveling thing, I mean, like, and like us being on the same page, part of it was sort of like once we started traveling, then like you're making decisions like every single day, all the time. And then you really start to get to know your partner and what's important to each other, right? Because then we're exploring a lot of stuff for the first time, right? Like there's so many things that we see that is on the tourist circuit and not on the tourist circuit. We're like, we went to Venice. We're like, Venice is amazing. But there's plenty of people that will be like, Venice sucks, right? A lot of
Hmm.
people say that, which is fine. It's just difference of opinion. But it's just like every place we went to, like my wife and I would sync up and be like, okay, like this food is amazing. This is worth it. This is not worth it. We thought like we should do this. And like our traveling style also like evolved. Like we're okay spending this kind of money. We're okay with did this type of accommodation. We're okay with this for our kids. Like it was just constantly all these decisions we had to make together.
Was there a moment when you felt like I found it? I know now.
Um, I don't know if there was a moment, but I think it's one of those things that like it's almost like a volume button, right? It's not like the TV's on or off. It's sort of like you're trying to tune the volume, and it's a weird analogy, but to say like discontentment is some kind of volume that you can just like keep lowering until it's like kind of non-existent. But because we all have emotions, right? That vary all the time. But I think in some way I was just slowly turning the volume down on that sort of discontentment, and eventually it sort of just got to a quiet place where it wasn't bothering as much. And for me, like I was kind of like even like I know while I was traveling, I was still trying to figure a lot of things out. So like every country we went to, I really tried to like seek out the local culture to just try to like explain life to me. And then it may sound a little bit like eat, pray, love, but that's kind of what I was doing before that book came out. I was like, when I went to like Thailand, I would like go on a Buddhist retreat, even though I'm not Buddhist. When I was in Thailand, I was also doing kickboxing because like I was like, okay, like what kind of connection do people feel when they do these activities? Why are people drawn to these things? Because like some people are passionate about certain things, right? Like what makes them passionate?
Yeah.
And I was trying to figure that out, right? So like every country I would go to, like I would try to like be as involved in terms of the local culture and just trying to figure out, okay, like does this resonate with me and what resonated with me and not? And even when I moved to Taiwan, I don't think I was like at a Zen state. I was still working on a lot of things. But I think what finally sort of made me at peace when we were traveling, we were just traveling, right? So everything was really temporary. So like everything was sort of up in the air. So it was hard to feel settled anyways. But as my life in Taiwan became more settled, then like things kind of became a lot more peaceful. And so many people will tell you as a foreigner in Taiwan or whatever, they miss home and they miss certain things that are comfortable to them. But in the end, like they've come to some sort of peace. And I think for me, like it took a couple of years being here and our life being more normalized for me to be like, okay, like I think I'm in actually a really good place. The other part that I would say to that is actually, I guess it's also related to your dad bod moniker is also, it's like I really got into endurance sports because in the US, sports is huge and it's awesome. Like there's like intramural sports, there's team sports, there's corporate sports. Moving to Taiwan, like the team element wasn't as big. And a lot of people did these individual sports, but there's a huge communities around people who do endurance sports. So we just happened to meet people who were very active and they sort of encourage us to be as well. When I was in New York, I had, I went to the doctor and I had like high cholesterol and he was like, oh, you should probably try to change your lifestyle or get on medication. And I started changing my lifestyle at that point. I started trying to be more healthy. And then this was sort of an extension of that. Sort of like one thing led to the other, right? You start doing a race and you're like, well, let me do a longer race. And then there's different types of races. And then I started doing triathlons. So I've been training for triathlons and you kind of do like longer and longer distances. And then there's a whole great community around that. Biking is really big in Taiwan. So I do a lot of biking. It's an activity I really enjoy. So I think being out in nature, what's really great is like here within 15 minutes, you can be from city center to like the mountains. So you can be hiking, you can be biking, and you could be just like all alone in nature. And I think that's been really refreshing and really healthy for me too. So
yeah. So I guess you're answering usually what I reserve as the last question. How's your dad bod? Is that it sounds like you're in peak physical condition these days.
Yeah, I would definitely never have expected that to be the case. But this year I'm 40 and, I've done my fastest half marathon. I signed up for a marathon next year. I did a Ironman 70.3 this year.
That's amazing. I mean, congrats on those athletic achievements and keeping up, more than keeping up, excelling at the age of 40. That's awesome. Dad bod can take on a lot of shapes, including the best shape of your life too. So sounds like that's the case for you. So I wanted to ask you, kind of go a little bit deeper. You mentioned your family a little bit, not a ton, but I want to hear a little bit about that. Like, what does your family think about your lifestyle? What do they think about what Doug's doing out there?
I think in some ways, my parents have always been a little bit hands-off. We immigrated to the US because my dad went to school in the US. So he came for a 2-year degree. And basically, after the 2-year degree, he went back to Taiwan for work. And basically, my parents decided that it was better for us to stay in the US long term. So I stayed here with my mom and my sister. In some ways, like it was a very non-traditional family upbringing because my dad wasn't really present, but also like we had a lot of independence because it was just my mom. And then a lot of times like my mom had to travel. And so we were kind of like doing our own thing from a young age already. And I think generally my parents have sort of allowed me to sort of do what I wanted to do. I mean, of course, like they have suggestions and a lot of that is more traditional that follows a playbook. But I think in a lot of ways, I was lucky because in Taiwan, it's a country of small business owners. It's a country of people who are like hustling and kind of doing their own thing and living their own life. And you see that now. There's not a lot of like huge conglomerates. I'm talking about like the Walmart types, right? I mean, there are still big companies that people have heard of, but it's really a company of small mom and pop. And, when you meet young people now, like it's very different than the US when people are like trying to do startups. It's just like a lot of people are just doing passion projects and doing things that they feel like will actually give them fulfillment. So I don't think what I'm doing is that different from that type of mode.
Did you know that about Taiwan before you moved there?
I did, but I don't know if that would have been a reason more for me to move there. It just more explains why I think my parents are more okay with my lifestyle because both my parents' families are entrepreneurial. So I think in some ways it's a little bit normal. And I think it's kind of interesting because I'm doing a reverse immigration. My parents worked very hard for me to be in the US, only for me to kind of reverse that, which I think for a lot of parents, they would not be happy with. And I actually see that a lot. Like some people of that generation will ask me, like, are you teaching your kids English? Because, it's more important than Chinese. And I definitely understand where they're coming from. But I think for my parents, they've always sort of had this love for their own homeland. So I think that was sort of an easy sell for them as well. And they do spend a lot of time here. And because like my dad was in Taiwan, we were in the US, we would actually do a lot of traveling ever since we were young just to meet up. And that was
Mhm.
sort of in some ways instilled to me when I was young and my love of travel. So I think there's a lot of things that worked out based on my background. And I think in general, my parents were a little bit more hands off that allowed me the freedom to do that. I think my wife's family is a little bit more traditional, and I think it's pretty difficult for them to understand. But I think in a lot of ways, like we're already doing it. So there's only so much that they can say, right?
Right.
And I think it's one of those things that, like, if you're successful at it, there's also only so much they can say, right? Because it's like, we're living the life that we want on our own terms, and we're not asking anybody for help. We're not asking anybody for anything. If they have requirements of us, we're doing our best to meet that as well, right? So it's not like we're neglecting our family responsibilities.
Your parents were very hands off, and so you had a lot of independence. And I can draw a line from all this independence to where you are today and this ability to operate in chaos, to be flexible, to explore. But what was it like for you growing up as a kid with that independence? Did you value the independence as well when you were a kid?
No, I don't think so. I think as a kid, you actually want stability and structure, right? I think that's what a lot of people say about their own kids is that, like, it's important for them to understand normalcy of life because otherwise, like, they just don't know how to operate. So I think it was a little bit chaotic for me. And I think that actually shaped me in a negative way when I was young because we often moved around a lot. I went to a lot of different schools. So I didn't have a lot of friends because we were just always moving and not very like continuous background.
Geographically, where were you moving to? Was it kind of all over the country or?
So it was mostly the Northeast. We first came to the US, we're in Connecticut. We moved to Western Pennsylvania, and we mostly stayed in Western Pennsylvania, but I just went to a lot of different schools in Western Pennsylvania. And I think that was a factor of my parents just valuing the best education. So like any
Okay.
opportunity that they have to like go to the better school, they would try to push me to the better school. So, I moved around different neighborhoods quite a bit because of that. I don't necessarily think that was good for me, but I guess the way that you're framing it is making me think that, oh, I guess that was sort of instilled to me at a young age.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about the things that have shaped our character. Sometimes they felt great as they were shaping our character. I think a lot of times they feel terrible. So you have a lot of new kid in school experiences, then it sounds like. Oh, there's the new kid, Doug. Is that true?
Yeah, and then I think what was also hard was like the neighborhoods that we would move to were very, very different from each other. Some of them were like super urban, some of them were super suburban, and like just the lifestyles and the type of schools they were very different and took a lot of adjusting to. And then my parents being immigrants, I don't think they knew, I don't think they understood that about America. They didn't understand that America was so diverse and had these different situations. I mean, I do think about that for my own kids because I didn't like moving a lot as a kid, and that's something I'm thinking actively about because I tell my wife all the time, it's like our next move is going to be our sort of semi-permanent move because I just don't want to disrupt the kids too much. And I talk to the kids about it too, just to prep them, and like I tell them, oh, one day we may leave Taiwan, and they're sort of like their mind is kind of blown because to them Taiwan is home.
Right. Right.
But I sort of try to remind them that, you guys are also American and we travel all the time. So they know that like the world is bigger than just this small island that we live on now. I do take some of the good and bad about my own childhood and try to think about how that will affect my kids and how I want to raise them now.
You're clearly taking a very different tack to fatherhood than your dad did. Very different contexts and circumstances as well. But what do you feel like you learned from your dad, or like what's sort of the imprint that he's left on you?
I think it's tough for me to answer this question just because I don't have much of a relationship with my dad because we didn't spend that much time together as a child. And then even now, like I kind of mentioned it earlier, but basically, once your kid is 18, like you probably only see them once or twice a year for the rest of your life. And the time together isn't always that meaningful, right? It could just be like, oh, let's get dinner together. And you're not really diving deep into conversations. For me, my dad has always sort of been distant, and that's always been the case. And that's not the type of dad I want to be. And that's also shaped why, like, I value this first 12 years so much because I feel like if I have this great foundation for my kids by being there for them, by being present, then like I'm not so worried about their next 60 years because like I know that I have a good foundation. I think his influence on me probably wasn't a good one, but it ended up allowing me to think about how I want to raise my own kids.
Yeah. Yeah. It was an example to contrast yourself with, at least. it sounds
Right.
like.
And the thing is, kind of like what you're saying in terms of circumstances and environment, I think we just live in completely different times. People who immigrated 40 years ago, I mean, their countries were very different than their countries are now. We live in a completely different situation than people who did 40 years ago. So, I understand economically things were very different and what people value were completely different. But as someone who has a privilege of being in this position, and a lot of that is because of my parents, because of finances, because of being in the US, like I'm able to do this for my kids, even though it's very different than probably what my parents had done for me or what they had envisioned. I think what they did enabled me to be able to do what I'm doing now.
Yeah. So looking ahead, you mentioned that the next move you guys make maybe in a couple of years or so, that's going to be the somewhat permanent one. Is Taiwan on the list as we might stay? And then part B to the question, is New York City on the potential list?
New York City is definitely not on the list. Taiwan is on the list. And I think it's a really hard question because what I'm trying to answer is what I think all parents are trying to do. Like, in some ways, you're trying to predict the future, right? I'm like, in 20 years, what is the world going to be like? And what would be their best outcome or what would be the best expected value? I mean, it's an impossible forecasting game. And I think to be really blunt, like, if I want my kids to make a ton of money and be rich, I should move to the US because the US is still the one thing it does amazing is there's innovation, like there's a lot of opportunity. But for me, that's not the only thing that's important, even though that is sort of what the world tells me is important. And I think that's the safest bet. It's the safest route. I struggle with that a lot because all the other paths that is not Taiwan or the US would be a lot of hardship because like I need to figure out how to get residency. I need to figure out how to get a way to live there and a way to work there and a different language and all these things. So it's like, is the juice worth the squeeze? It's hard. You don't know. And that's sort of what I'm trying to figure out. I sort of like know the Taiwan scenario. I know the US scenario because I grew up there. I know what this is going to look like for my kids. But the question is like, is that what I want for them in 20 years and 40 years, right?
So I guess is your main criteria in examining different potential places, putting aside the challenge of being an immigrant in that country? Let's say it's all equal. Let's say there wasn't, really any difference. All countries are the same as far as a challenge to be an immigrant there. Are you looking at it from, is this the right place for the right values to be passed on to my kids or to be nurtured in my kids? Is that the main thing that you're looking at?
Yeah. Yeah. So I kind of said it before, but like ideology and like my philosophy on life, I think generally I don't have a very American capitalistic view on life. So that makes me sort of at odds with the American society. It makes it very difficult for me to live there because I always feel like an outsider. I always feel like the odd man out. I just feel like I'm just kind of a weirdo because I'm just doing stuff that other people don't normally do. And I don't think my kids have that kind of personality. But what I like about the way I'm raising my kids, I think they're super happy. I think they have tons of really great relationships. I think they have tons of great skills that they're picking up. And I think all that will serve them very well in the future. But what we've been kind of doing every summer is that we've been sort of doing, let's call it market research. So 2 summers ago, we went to Barcelona and we lived in a very local neighborhood in Barcelona to basically test out what life would be like if we moved to Barcelona. And we decided that that was not going to work for us. And we love Barcelona. I think it's a great place. And I think if it was just my wife and I, it would be great for a place to live. But we decided it doesn't really work for our family with our kids. And then next summer, we're going to the Netherlands. We are going to do the same market research where we stay in a very local area, go to a local school, and just try to live a local life to see if that's something that we want to do. And I think my wife wants to wait until we do that research before she makes a decision on, if that's something that we actually want to pursue or not. So,
And how did the Netherlands make the list?
so I think for me, Europe is always on the list because in terms of philosophy, in terms of ideology, it's more aligned. Life there is more than just work. Europeans love to just enjoy life. And I think that's sort of something I've been trying to live by. And then I think the Netherlands, there's an opportunity for Americans to move there and get some sort of residency easily, but obviously you still have to contribute to the economy, contribute to society, and that's something that we would still have to work at. But it's a easier path. It's not the easiest. The reason we went to Spain was that Spain is quite easy. Portugal is also very, very easy. But I think for my wife and I, the biggest priority is our kids and how we want to raise them and where we want them to succeed. I know what kids need in terms of structure, with friendships, relationships, and mentorship from, staff and faculty at schools. And I think that's really important. I want to focus on that the next 12 years or so. But I'm sure you also feel the same way. I mean, time just flies. Like 12 years is going to go in a blink of an eye. And then we'll be empty nesters again, and we can just do the things that we want to do. So,
No, you see it. It's like, it's exciting. It's thrilling because you have all those times where you're dealing with little kid stuff and you're completely, just kind of logistically overwhelmed just with kids. You're like, oh man, if we could only, go out for dinner or something like that. That seems so hard to get. And then you think about, like, we see some kids who are like 8th grade or high school and they're like basically out, especially like in New York, they're just out. Yeah. So you're like, wait a second, I thought I had till 18. And I think this is your point. Actually, there's like maybe a first half step where it's like, oh, they are actually able to pretty much fend for themselves, like on a basic day-to-day level, and they want it as well. So you have they're capable and they want it. Those two things combined, and all of a sudden you're like a half empty nester, kind of, is what we've seen.
Oh, totally.
Which is crazy.
I think in some ways it's coming earlier and in some ways it's not, because like when we were growing up, like we had tons of freedom that would be unthinkable today.
Right.
But in some ways, the reason I say it's earlier is because we're losing our kids to electronics. It's just easier, right? When you're on your phone, or you're on your, and not even a phone, it can be just like your iPad or some other tablet device, or on their smartwatch. It's sort of like they're tuned out. So like, and I am just as guilty of that. So I'm not going to say that I don't use my phone, but there's many times where I'm focused on my phone, texting something, working on something that I shouldn't be, when I should be focused my attention elsewhere. But I know that in myself.
Right.
And kids are humans and they will do the exact same thing. So personally, like, I know that's going to come. It could be sooner than 12. Like I only have less than 2 years with my kids, and it's going to come like really fast. And if I don't cherish that now, I mean, I think about it this way. I honestly do not work that much. And it's not because I don't need to. I definitely need to. And if anyone looked at my business P&L or my income statements, like, it's not impressive. If you talk about from a Wall Street perspective, like there hasn't been much growth, there hasn't been, like, you're not putting like multiple P's on my business. And that's something I'm okay with. That's something I've made a decision that we're a flat business and, like margins aren't great. But the reason that's okay for me is like, there's things that I value more than making money. Right.
Yeah.
And because of that, like, it's not an easy decision for me, but at least it's something that is easier, that I can stomach, because I know that once my kids are teenagers, then that'll be my time to work. Then I will bust my butt. And who knows if I will or not, but at least that's the way I kind of think about it, is like, these years I'm never going to get back, but my working years, like, why? I can work later. And
do it later.
So that, I mean,
I like that. Well, this has been a lot of fun, Doug. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for doing this.
It was a great conversation for me too, about learning about myself, even though I'm telling you about myself. So Thank you.
That's what I hope for. I mean, I'm doing this out of a passion, and maybe that's my Taiwanese side coming through. I didn't realize that we have these entrepreneurial roots. So I appreciate learning that from you about myself. So that is the spirit behind the Dad Bod, and makes total sense that you'd be contributing to it. So thank you again, Doug. I really appreciate it.
If you ever come by this side of the world, definitely let me know.
Okay, Dad number 11 of the Dad Bod is in the books. Big thanks to Doug for sharing his story. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that it brought a little something positive to your day. If you like what we're doing with the Dad Bod, hit that subscribe button and give it a 5-star review in your podcast app, or email me anytime at sean@thedadbodpod.com. Thanks again for listening.